The message arrived at 60:42 am, a single line that split my chest open. Don't come to my wedding. Claire doesn't want you there. No greeting. No explanation. Just that. I read it again and again, waiting for the punchline, for the follow-up that never came. I'd raised my son alone after his father died, 2 jobs, sleepless nights, scraped knees, college tuition I paid late but paid anyway. I had imagined his wedding since he was a boy, where I'd sit, what I'd wear, how he'd smile when he saw me. I typed and deleted a dozen replies. Finally, I sent one sentence. I understand, I wish you happiness. Then I went quiet. I didn't cry where anyone could see. I cried in the laundry room, between the hum of the dryer and the smell of detergent. I folded his childhood into boxes that week, trophies, drawings, the graduation cap I'd kept in pristine plastic. I stopped calling, I stopped explaining. I stopped begging for a place in a life I was clearly not wanted in. Instead, I changed my will, not out of spite, out of clarity. The small house I'd finally paid off, signed to a charitable trust for single parents. The savings account I'd built dollar by dollar, converted into scholarships, his name nowhere on them. The family heirlooms, my mother's ring, my grandmother's pearls, donated to a museum with a note about the women who carried families on their backs. I kept only what I needed to live simply and quietly. On the day of the wedding, I took a train to the coast. I walked the beach alone, shoes in hand, and let the waves erase the H. I wished him well again, this time for real, and let go of the version of motherhood that required my erasure. 3 months passed. Then the calls started. At first, I let them ring. Then the texts came, frantic and long. Apologies, confusion, misunderstandings. Finally, my son showed up at my door, eyes red, hands shaking. Claire stood behind him, stiff and pale. They sat on my couch like guests who knew they'd overstayed their welcome. Claire spoke first. She said she'd felt threatened, that she wanted a clean start, that she thought it would be temporary. My son stared at the floor. He said he hadn't meant it that way. He said he thought I'd understand. He said he didn't know about the changes until the lawyer called. They begged. They asked me to reverse it, to come back into their lives, to fix it. I listened. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse. I poured tea and let the silence do the work. When they finished, I told them the truth. I didn't change anything to punish you, I said. I changed it because I learned where I stood. My son cried then, real tears, the kind that come when consequences finally land. Claire reached for his hand and found it trembling. I love you, I told him. That didn't change. But love doesn't require me to disappear, and it doesn't require me to bankroll my own exclusion. They left quieter than they arrived. We speak now, sometimes. Carefully. I'm not a ghost anymore, but I'm not a safety net either. Trust, once folded away, takes time to unfold. And that's the revenge no one expects, not rage, not spectacle, just self-respect, calmly exercised, and a life that goes on without asking permission. The text message arrived without warning, without softness, without even a greeting. And in that single moment it erased decades of devotion, as if they were nothing more than a typo. A mother who had spent her life placing her son at the center of every decision, suddenly found herself pushed to the edge, with one blunt sentence telling her not to come to his wedding, because his future wife didn't want her there. It wasn't just an invitation being withdrawn, it was a declaration that her presence, her sacrifices, and her role in his life were now considered inconvenient. She read the words over and over, hoping she had misunderstood, hoping there was another message coming that would explain it all away as a mistake or a joke. None came. The silence that followed was louder than any argument, forcing her to confront a truth she had never prepared for, that love given freely does not always guarantee loyalty in return. Her mind raced back through years of memories she had built around him, nights spent awake nursing fevers, mornings rushing to work after packing lunches, evenings helping with homework when exhaustion weighed heavy on her bones. She remembered standing in the rain at school events, clapping louder than anyone else, and telling herself that one day it would all be worth it. Now, with a few careless words typed into a phone, she was being told that she did not belong at one of the most important moments of his life. The pain was sharp, but what hurt even more was the way the message stripped her of dignity, offering no space for discussion, no respect for the bond that had once been unbreakable. Instead of reacting in anger, she chose restraint, though it cost her more than tears could measure. She typed a reply, erased it, typed again, then erased it once more, knowing that any emotional outburst would only reduce her to the stereotype of the difficult mother she was now being painted as. In the end, she sent a calm, Brief response wishing him happiness, a sentence that masked the devastation behind it. That quiet reply was not weakness. It was the first moment she reclaimed control over a situation designed to humiliate her. By refusing to argue, she denied them the satisfaction of watching her beg for a place she should never have had to ask for. In the days that followed, she carried the pain privately. She cried where no one could hear, held her own hands when they shook, and learned how to sit with the ache without letting it turn her bitter. The world went on as usual, unaware that something sacred had been taken from her, but inside she was reshaping her understanding of love, boundaries, and self-worth. The wedding date circled on her calendar became a reminder not of loss alone, but of a hard-earned lesson that respect is not optional, even in family. That single text did more than uninvite her from a ceremony. It awakened her to the necessity of valuing herself when others chose not to. After the message, there was an expectation, spoken or not, that she would react the way people often do when they are hurt with anger, pleading, long explanations, or desperate attempts to be understood. Society almost demands noise from pain, as if suffering must announce itself loudly to be real. But she chose something far more difficult. She chose silence. Not the kind that sulks or manipulates, but a deliberate, disciplined quiet that protected her dignity when everything inside her was screaming to be heard. She understood that any emotional response would likely be twisted, used as proof that excluding her had been the right decision all along. So she stepped back, not because she didn't care, but because she cared enough about herself to refuse humiliation. Each day after that decision tested her resolve. Her phone stayed close, as if it might suddenly deliver an apology or clarification, but she resisted the urge to reach out first. She did not show up uninvited, did not ask mutual relatives to intervene, did not post cryptic messages online. This restraint was an act of strength, even though it felt like walking through fire barefoot. Silence, she learned, is not emptiness, it is space. And in that space, she began to hear her own thoughts more clearly than she had in years. Without the constant role of being needed, she confronted the quiet question she had avoided for too long: who was she when she was not giving everything away? Choosing peace over drama required her to grieve privately. There were moments when she rehearsed conversations in her head, explaining her hurt with perfect clarity, imagining that if she just said the right words, everything would be fixed. But she recognized that explanations are wasted on people who have already decided not to listen. By staying silent, she preserved her energy and refused to chase validation from those who had withdrawn it. This was not passive acceptance, it was active self-respect. She was no longer willing to fight for a seat at a table where her absence was so easily requested. As the wedding day approached, the pressure to break her silence increased. Friends asked if she was excited. Family members hinted that she should just let it go, for the sake of harmony. She smiled and changed the subject, understanding that peace does not always look like reconciliation. Sometimes it looks like walking away without slamming the door. On the day itself, she did not sit at home replaying imagined scenes or stalking photos online. She chose a different kind of ritual, one that honored her healing rather than her rejection. By doing so, she reclaimed control over her emotions and refused to let a single event define her worth. In that quiet period, she discovered something unexpected. Her silence spoke louder than any confrontation ever could. It forced reflection where arguments would have caused defensiveness. It shifted the power dynamic, placing her not in the position of the rejected, but of the self-possessed. Peace became her statement, dignity her response. And in choosing calm over chaos, she laid the foundation for a future where she would no longer accept love that required her to diminish herself. While the world assumed she was simply moving on, something far deeper was happening in the quiet of her everyday life. The silence she had chosen gave her clarity, and with that clarity came a realization: she could no longer ignore the future she had carefully built was still tied to people who had shown they could discard her without hesitation. For years, every financial decision she made had been rooted in love and responsibility. She saved not for luxury, but for security, for her son's future, for the family she believed would always include her. Now, that belief had been shaken, and she understood that planning for tomorrow required honesty about today. So, without announcing it to anyone, she began to rearrange her legacy. The decision to change her will was not fueled by anger, despite what others might later assume. It was born from self-respect. She sat with documents spread across her kitchen table, the same table where her son had once done homework and begged for extra dessert. Each signature felt heavy, not because she doubted her choice, but because she was finally acknowledging a painful truth. Love that is conditional cannot be rewarded as though it were unconditional. She redirected what she had worked her entire life to build toward causes that reflected her values: support for single parents, educational funds for children who would never know the safety she had tried to provide. In doing so, she ensured that her sacrifices would still mean something, even if they no longer served the people she once centered her life around. As she sorted through belongings and accounts, memories surfaced with each item: jewelry passed down through generations, savings accounts labeled with her son's name, insurance papers she had never imagined revising. All of it reminded her of the woman she had been endlessly giving, rarely questioning whether she was allowed to want security of her own. Letting go of those plans was not an act of erasure, it was an act of redefinition. She was choosing to honor herself in ways she never had before, recognizing that generosity should never require self-abandonment. This quiet restructuring of her future gave her a sense of peace she hadn't expected. For the first time, her life no longer revolved around anticipation, waiting for visits, hoping for calls, planning for milestones that might never include her. Instead, she focused on building a life grounded in stability and purpose. She simplified her routines, invested time in friendships she had neglected, and allowed herself small joys without guilt. The fear of being labeled selfish lingered, but it grew weaker with each passing day as she realized how distorted that label had been all along. What made this choice powerful was that no one knew about it at first. There were no dramatic announcements, no warnings, no ultimatums. She didn't use her decisions as leverage or threats. She simply adjusted her path to align with reality. By the time others became aware of the changes, they were already finalized, legally and emotionally. The control she reclaimed was subtle but absolute, rooted in foresight rather than reaction. In reshaping her legacy, she wasn't closing her heart, she was protecting it. She left room for reconciliation, but not at the cost of her dignity. Her future was no longer dependent on the approval of those who had dismissed her so easily. Instead, it reflected a woman who finally understood her own worth and chose to invest in a life that honored it quietly, firmly, and without apology. Time has a way of exposing truths that words try to hide. In the weeks after the wedding, life returned to its surface normalcy for everyone else, but underneath, small fractures began to widen. The excitement faded, the photos were posted and forgotten, and reality settled in with its quiet weight. Bills arrived, plans stalled, conversations turned tense. It was then that the absence they had so confidently enforced began to make itself felt. The woman they had excluded was the same woman who had always been the steady presence, the one who anticipated problems before they appeared, who softened landings and filled gaps without being asked. Without her, things felt less certain, less supported, and far more fragile than either of them had expected. At first, the realization came as confusion. There were unanswered questions about finances, about family matters, about traditions and connections they had never bothered to learn because she had always handled them. When they reached out casually, expecting help to arrive as it always had, they were met with polite distance. No anger, no lectures, just the unmistakable sense that something had changed. That quiet boundary unsettled them more than an argument ever could have. It forced them to confront a truth they had avoided: access to someone's care is not guaranteed simply because it once existed. As weeks turned into months, the consequences became harder to ignore. A lawyer's call delivered news neither of them had anticipated, and panic replaced confidence. They learned that the safety net they assumed would always be there had been carefully folded away. The future they had imagined, one cushioned by inherited security and unquestioned support, suddenly felt unstable. This was not punishment delivered with cruelty, it was reality arriving late. For the first time, they understood that the woman they had dismissed was not just a background figure in their lives, but a pillar they had taken for granted. Regret has a way of humbling people, and it arrived heavy and unavoidable. They replayed the moment of exclusion, the ease with which they had decided she was expendable, and the discomfort of realizing how wrong they had been. Apologies formed too late, shaped by fear as much as remorse. When they finally reached out, their words were urgent, layered with explanations and justifications, as if intent could erase impact. They asked for understanding, for forgiveness, for a return to how things were, without fully grasping that some doors, once closed, do not reopen on command. When they came to her, it was not with the authority they once felt, but with uncertainty and shame. They asked to be welcomed back into the safety they had rejected, hoping love would override consequence. She listened, not with bitterness, but with clarity. She saw in them the discomfort of people facing outcomes they never believed would apply to them. Their regret was real, but so was the lesson. What they failed to realize at first was that time had changed her too. In those months of distance, she had learned how to live without bracing for disappointment, how to build a life that did not hinge on being needed. Their sudden awareness did not erase her growth. The power had shifted quietly, decisively. Where once she had waited to be included, now she stood firmly in her own life, choosing carefully what, and who, deserved a place in it. 3 months had been enough to teach them that exclusion has a cost, and that love, when disrespected, does not simply remain on standby. The reckoning they faced was not dramatic, but it was profound. They had learned too late that when you push away someone who loves you deeply, you may one day find yourself standing on the outside, asking for the very grace you once denied. When they finally came back, it was not with confidence or certainty, but with desperation thinly disguised as humility. The visit wasn't planned weeks in advance the way joyful reunions are. It was rushed, clumsy, driven by urgency rather than love. The knock on her door carried none of the warmth it once did. When she opened it, she immediately saw the difference in them. Their shoulders were heavy, their eyes uncertain, as if they were standing before someone whose power they had only just begun to understand. The balance had shifted, and they felt it. They spoke quickly at first, stumbling over explanations, afraid that if they paused too long she might close the door again. They said there had been misunderstandings, that emotions had been high, that things had gotten out of hand. They admitted mistakes, but carefully, as though still hoping those mistakes could be minimized. Then the truth surfaced, clumsy and raw. They had learned about the changes, about the will, about the future that no longer revolved around them. Panic had followed immediately. The safety they assumed was permanent had vanished, and suddenly the past mattered in ways it hadn't before. Their voices softened. Apologies came next, layered one on top of another, each trying to sound more sincere than the last. They begged her to reverse what she had done, to put things back the way they were. They promised things would be different now, more respect, more inclusion, more appreciation. They spoke of family, of forgiveness, of how life is too short to hold on to hurt. Beneath every word, though, was fear, not just of losing her emotionally, but of losing what her presence had always quietly guaranteed. She listened without interrupting, no folded arms, no raised voice, just calm attention. In the past, this would have been the moment where she rushed to reassure them, where she absorbed their panic and smoothed it away. This time, she stayed still. Silence, once again, did the heavy lifting. It forced them to sit with their own words, to hear how transactional their regret sounded when stripped of urgency's polish. When she finally spoke, it was not to scold them. She told them she had heard everything they said. She told them she believed they were sorry. And then she told them that sorrow does not undo clarity. What she had changed was not a reaction. It was a decision made with careful thought. During months, when no one was begging her for anything, she explained that she could not pretend those months hadn't existed, or that the lesson they taught her hadn't reshaped how she saw herself. They tried again. Tears came this time, real ones, messy and uncontrolled. They reminded her of love, of history, of shared memories. She acknowledged all of it. Love was still there. History was real. But trust, she said gently, is not restored by fear of consequences. And love that only becomes loud when something is lost is not the same as love that protects before harm is done. She did not slam the door on them. She did not declare the relationship over. What she refused to do was erase her growth to make them comfortable. The changes would stand, not as punishment but as boundaries. She told them that reconciliation, if it was to happen, would be slow, earned through consistency rather than promises. The future would no longer be built on assumptions. They left quieter than they arrived, carrying the weight of a truth they hadn't wanted to face. They had begged her to undo what she had done, believing love meant restoration without consequence. What they learned instead was far more unsettling, that love can remain, even when access changes, and that some decisions, once made in clarity, are not meant to be reversed. What she carried away from everything was not bitterness, and that surprised even her. She had expected anger to linger, a sharp edge to remain after being dismissed so casually, and then summoned back when the cost became clear. Instead, what settled in her was something steadier and far more powerful: self-respect. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It didn't demand apologies or public recognition. It simply reshaped how she moved through the world and how she allowed others to move around her. She finally understood that strength does not come from being indispensable to others, but from being whole on your own. For years, her identity had been wrapped in sacrifice. She measured her worth by how much she gave, how often she showed up, how deeply she absorbed discomfort so others could feel secure. Letting go of that role felt unfamiliar at first, almost wrong, as though she were breaking an unspoken rule. But with time, she realized that constant self-erasure was never love, it was conditioning. True love, she learned, does not ask you to shrink, to tolerate disrespect, or to wait quietly while others decide whether you matter. The calm she now carried confused people. Some expected her to soften, to eventually undo everything once emotions cooled. Others assumed she was punishing them in a quieter way. She corrected none of those assumptions. Peace did not require explanation. Her boundaries were no longer reactive. They were rooted. She stayed open, but not exposed. Kind, but not available on demand. The difference changed every interaction she had, not just with them, but with the world. With her son, the relationship continued, but it stood on new ground. Conversations were more careful, less entitled. There was affection, but also awareness. He learned, slowly, that her presence was a gift, not a guarantee. With Claire, respect replaced tension, not because wounds were forgotten, but because power dynamics had shifted. No one needed to dominate anymore. The unspoken understanding was clear: exclusion has consequences, and reconciliation does not erase them. What surprised her most was how light she felt. Without the constant need to prove her love through sacrifice, she discovered room for joy that had nothing to do with approval. She took trips without asking permission. She spent money on herself without guilt. She rested without explaining why. These small freedoms, once denied, became daily affirmations of her worth. She wasn't waiting to be chosen anymore. She had already chosen herself. People often misunderstand revenge, imagining it as cruelty returned in equal measure. What she learned is that the most lasting form of revenge doesn't look like revenge at all. It looks like growth that cannot be undone, confidence that doesn't flinch, and boundaries that remain intact no matter who tests them. By refusing to collapse back into her old role, she ensured that what happened would never happen again. Not because others changed overnight, but because she did. She did not close her heart. She simply stopped handing it over without care. Love was still present in her life, quieter, healthier, mutual. And in that balance, she found something far more satisfying than vindication: freedom. The freedom to be valued without begging, to give without disappearing, and to stand firmly in the knowledge that dignity, once claimed, does not need to be defended.